Thank you very much. The impact of digital technologies on existing city as well as on ongoing urbanization processes is far from clear. The main reason lies probably in the complex blend of realistic and utopian attitudes that characterize the field. The digital city is as much a dream as a reality. To assess the true extent of the changes that are actually taking place is made all the more difficult that digital technology, at least as far as today, do not have a direct impact on space. In other words, they do not change immediately the form of cities. If we take, for example, the 22 at Barcelona, which is one of the most important development in that respect in Southern Europe, the district looks relatively classical in terms of urban design. Digital technologies, I will argue, affect rather our understanding of cities. For instance, they have radically transformed the content and scope of mapping procedure, and I'll come back to this issue again and again in this presentation. But there again, the utopian dimension is very present. If you take OpenStreetMap, for example, it clearly has an utopian connotation, which is ambition to democratize map making. So what I'd like to do is first to evoke this mix of reality and utopia and the way actually things have not turned exactly as we thought they would, before turning to three major dimensions of the relation between digital technologies and urbanization. And this will be real time, then augmented reality, and finally the individual dimension. So let's begin by utopias and reality. When digital culture began to permeate urban life, far beyond the mere use of computers, a lot of predictions were made regarding the way they would transform the city. For example, one heard a lot in the early 1990s that physical flows would decrease because of the growth of electronic exchanges. Bill Mitchell, the late Bill Mitchell, for example, made this kind of thing, and it's true that the growth of electronic exchanges has been spectacular. This is the internet traffic linked to the stock exchange activity in New York, mapped by Senso Lab at MIT. So, of course, this has increased, but actually physical circulation have also increased, and never have physical infrastructure been as important as today. Another utopian idea, the planetary village, in which people would connect from very far and from very different kind of milieu. For example, at the time Second Life still existed, these three women could actually, these three avatars could hide. One person would be actually a man, one would be in Australia, the other in Europe, and the third in China. There again, so far, social networking has been very much linked to still local and physical sociability. Even if with the development of, with the development of social network, things are beginning to change a little bit. Last but not least, at the beginning of the diffusion of digital tools, digital media, etc., there was a widespread belief that dispersion would take precedence about concentration, following the decentralized structure of the internet that had been advocated by its pioneers. And this is the famous Paul Baran diagram of the decentralized network. Actually, metropolization seems in many cases to have taken over dispersion, something seen relatively early on by Manuel Castells and above all Saskia Sassen and her global city theme. So utopia did not exactly happen as expected. Even if things are still a bit unclear, for example, regarding mobility, for the first time in a country like France, mobility is beginning to stagnate a little bit. But the city has not evolved exactly under the influence of digital technology as one expected. So what I like to do, I still would like to present the way cities have been profoundly changed, in a way how urbanization has been profoundly transformed, but I will evoke three different dimensions than those I mentioned. The first one will be around the question, the multiplication of sensors of all sorts of monitoring and surveillance devices that inform us in real time of what's happening in various urban systems. This is what I've called real time, and then I'll try to explain what I mean by towards the city of event. Then I will say a few words on augmented reality, the hybridization between physical and electronic space, which is clearly another important aspect. And lastly, evoke the question of the individual dimension, which is very clearly a major aspect of what's going on today. And after evoking these three dimensions, if I still have time, I'd like to pick three themes which are related to this changing reading of the city. The first one is the question of the new model of urban development, what is very often referred to as the economy of knowledge. The second, the challenges of visibility and representation, the question of mapping, among other things, but also political representation. I'll come back to that. And finally, very briefly, a couple of words on the relation between digital technology and the quest for sustainability. So let's begin by real time towards a city of events. So as we know, the digital city today, it's very much a multiplication of sensors, of all kinds of measuring devices, of meters, etc., that can inform us in real time about all kinds of things that happen in the city. We can, for example, know pretty much now the state of things in various networks. This is the main control room of the water in Paris. It's interestingly, in Paris, the reading of water meters is done automatically and transmitted through Wi-Fi, and one can pretty much know what's happening in real time. So it's a major task, of course, to reorganize the city according to all this new information we have. And experiments are going all over the world, from the French city of Nice, for example, who is very much involved in those questions today, to South Korean Songdo. The consequence, once again, is that perhaps for the first time, one can know what is happening in the city. And this does not only concern politicians, administrators, engineers, but also users. For the people too young, you don't remember in Paris, for example, now you can know how much time you're going to wait for the bus, which, because you have the time, the bus, you can know where are the buses in the system, how much time you have to wait. You can know also what are people doing in real time, and that has led to all these kind of experiments. This is also Sensible Lab, and they tracked, actually, this is the density of cell phone calls generated by a concert of Madonna in Rome a few years ago. And actually, it's part of a moving film in which you can see the surface evolving. You can know pretty much what's happening. So the city becomes an information system, and in many cases, to urbanize means to lay out the main feature of this information system. Now, why event? Probably because philosopher Pierre Lévy once wrote a long time ago that a bit of information is actually not a thing. It's an atom of circumstance. It's an occurrence. Information happens. Information is related to what happens. And if you look at the broader evolution of city, it seems now that in a way cities are as much made of what happens within their space than of material things. The city itself becomes visible now through the millions of elementary measurements, sensing, and readings that give birth to more complex assessment of the situation in the city. The city is itself populated with all kinds of events, the situation of the traffic, what's happening in the various networks, and then it goes to broader questions like, for example, the role of festivals, etc., etc. It seems that the city is transforming itself as a set of events, which, by the way, tell also something. It's not digital tools that are the only one responsible for this evolution. They meet actually with a global urban evolution, in which cities become more and more a matter of events and scenario, better approached by using scenario than traditional planning tool. And it's very striking, if you take Paris, for example, how in some ways the plan has been replaced by scenario writing, and, for example, very much linked to festival activity. This is Paris Plage, which happens every year, and which actually I'll pass on these, was one of the triggers of the transformation, the very long-term transformation of the embankments of the Seine, and the project itself is presented a little bit like a festival. London presenting itself as a kind of Western Shanghai, as it did a few years ago in Venice Biennale. This is very much, this has oriented there again a lot of policies in London. So to finish on this part is, of course, the problem today is that with digital tools, the scenario and the reality, what is not yet there, and what has already been done is often blurred, and we all remember this picture of Dubai, in which many of the islands, which look like Google Earth, were actually non-existent and will never be built. So what makes things, of course, urbanization complex today is that fiction and reality are in a much more complex way kind of interaction than they used to be. Second dimension, I'll be more rapid, is augmented reality. One of the major pending questions is, of course, once again, how is architectural and urban space going to change? It has not changed yet, as I say, but it's probably going to. We know already that we've seen all kinds of spectacular geometries linked to the use of computer in architecture, but this might not be the most salient feature of the ongoing evolution on an urban standpoint. The main factor will definitely lie in the pervasive presence of electronics and the hybridization between the physical and the electronic that is taking place. And actually augmented reality begins with the presence of screen all over the city, of screen in a room. Augmented reality, as we know, function at all kinds of levels, from the cell phone to the giant urban screens. One of the things to note is that one of the questions today is how to go beyond the screen. Last thing I'd like to note is that the main question, there are probably two main questions about augmented reality. One is definitely how to go beyond the screen. The other is for what purpose. And augmented reality is populated with all kind of civic dreams. All municipalities around the world dream about what could be done with augmented reality. Truth is that so far, augmented reality is very much something that is triggered by commercial development. So there is definitely a question. So my first dimension, real-time and event-based urbanization. Second dimension, augmented reality. The third dimension I wanted to mention, probably a shift even more fundamental, is a city of individuals. We used to think of the city as populated with crowds. We now are seeing cities that becomes visible at the scale of the individual. Of course, the cell phone and all these kind of digital equipment have played a major role in the affair. Let me remind you that the cell phone usage is already around 50% in Africa and close to 100% in a lot of, and even beyond that, in a lot of developed countries. There again, one should not be technologically deterministic. This is actually a much broader evolution. Most of our societies are becoming very individual-centered. So how do we design cities for individual, and who are these individuals? Digital technology play a very important role in this process because they enable to do a number of things. First thing, they enable, and this is not a luxury today, to know who are the person, who are the individual. Biometrics is a thriving industry these days, and its intersection with urbanization is growing. Think of all the security devices, et cetera, that begin actually at your laptop, then the gate of buildings, the airport, et cetera, et cetera. Digital technology enable you to know where are the individuals. And geolocalization is another thriving domain. And I showed you a map by an MIT team. This is the Faber-Novel team in France, and this is again using cell phone localization, the activity this time generated by a soccer match in Barcelona. And finally, digital technology enable you to know what you're doing, and this is linked to more globally the rise of surveillance. These two, okay. With traditional camera, but also using more and more general thing. One thing I'd like to insist is that we tend still very often to think of surveillance as something external to us. Actually, what's happening today is that surveillance is becoming a condition, a kind of existential condition. Think of Facebook. Facebook is a wonderful panopticon in which everybody watches everybody, and which is a kind of global surveillance system, and the digital culture goes with this kind of surveillance condition, and there again with a lot of impact on the individual. The individual itself, can you just put, yeah, I think I'll tell you when to pass the slide because it's not working very well. The individual is very different. What we today consider as an individual than what we used to. We see him more and more as a network. Even inside the brain, we understand the brain as a network. This is the blue brain from Lausanne, to quote the rival institution. And so a networked individual, may I have the next? An individual in which for whom sensation matter, and it's very striking how the rise of digital culture has been accompanied by the big return of the question of sensation in architecture, in urban design, etc. May I have the next? And interestingly, for example, fooding is a direct also consequence of that, and it's quite revealing for me that trendy restaurants are among the most emblematic programs of contemporary digital architecture. The last thing is that, of course, this individual in the digital culture has a lot of new resources. For example, the big revolution in mapping is clearly that from the most ancient times to almost today, mapping used to be something done by specialists and not by everyone. Now, pretty much, can I have the next? Pretty much everyone can generate map. This is a map of crime in Boston, but thanks to the open data movement, everyone can create maps. So the individual of the digital era has new political and social ideals, and in some ways we're both under a regime of surveillance, but with new social aspiration, and their utopia is back. And let me just remind you of the role social networks have played in the recent evolution. Just the following, it started in some ways by the trendy flash mobs, but more recently with the Arab revolution, may I have the next, and the role played by Twitter and other things, we are in the middle of quite a massive change. So now I'd like to explore three dimensions that seems to me related to these three questions, at least related to the three dimensions I just evoked. The first is the question of new scenarios of urban development. New scenarios of urban development with all these ideas everybody is propagating these days. You take Florida's rise of the creative class, Edward Glaeser, triumph of the city, that what matters today more and more is knowledge, intellectual production, then which is translated into innovation with virtuous loops between universities, advanced research, etc., with a few models like the Silicon Valley, this is Cambridge, Mass, of course, the MIT campus, and all these things. It is clearly changing a lot of thought about urban economy. It's clear that these ideas of networking, enabling individuals to live fully their creative life, these things are transforming the way we see urbanization these days. And, speaking of Singapore, Singapore is clearly betting massively these days about this relation between universities, industries, etc. And this is not the only place. Melbourne has done the same. South of Paris, they're trying to build a new academic city. So this is very much pattern today. One of the questions is, of course, that this does not solve everything, because unfortunately not everybody can be part of the elite creative class for whom these things are done, and the problem remains of what's happening in the rest of the world. May I have the next? The other problem that geographer Graham and Marvin outlined in their book Splintering Urbanism is the fact that these create very uneven urban development with very highly developed zones, and then next to them, totally abandoned one. If you take, for example, Boston, it's quite striking how, you know, the high-tech zone is actually a small part of the larger Boston conurbation. So I'll leave that here because this is more trying to broach a number of issues, and I'd like to evoke now, go back to this idea of visibility, representation, and mapping. Yeah, I'll pass on that. So what I want to actually outline is that in some ways my main argument, if I would be to say that probably with digital technology, the real challenge is that in some ways we have to understand differently urbanization. It's not necessarily changing physically things immediately, but it's changing the way we understand them, especially because of the problems of representation. First problem, the new city generates an enormous mass of information. And then the problem becomes who has access to the information, at what level, and this is a political problem. I think traditionally, with traditional modes of production of information, information was reserved to the happy few, and there was no other way to do it. Today, you can pretty much share whatever you want with whoever you want, but you have to decide, and this is a huge political issue. Second issue, how do you represent the information in order to share it? And this is also very political. A good example of that, for example, in many developed cities are the maps of noise. As soon as you publish a map of noise, you're in the middle of political turmoil. So how do you visualize it? To whom do you communicate it? You can see that actually mapping, which is a problem of graphic representation of the city, becomes then a problem of politics and of political representation of the city. This is why what I call the challenges of visibility and representation. And there we can see how actually data and their visualization and their communication becomes a totally political problem. And it's in this context that we have to rethink of the formidable rise of urban mapping and urban cartography, and with the fact that once again everyone can produce maps. And sometimes quite strange things. This is Laura Kurgan, an American architect and artist, and her $1 million blocks. Basically, you can have access now to the money the federal state spends in the US to put people in jail, and then you can attribute that to the specific blocks where people were living before going to jail. And then you have a map, a strange map of the cost of criminality that you couldn't produce a few years ago. There again, with a lot of political questions. You can do maps at the level of the individual, and an artist like Christian Nold has equipped people with sensors, etc., and they're working in cities and producing what he calls emotional maps. So we can do all kinds of things. That does not mean that things are becoming transparent. Once again, Utopia is not yet there. First of all, because very often data are pre-formatted, even in the case of Nold, and there is the risk of excessive dependency upon digital tools, upon the software, etc., etc. Google Maps is, of course, a formidable freedom, but you're using Google. So that creates challenges. What is striking is the fact that we're confronted to very different kinds of dreams behind this kind of sprawling movement, two contradictory tendencies. The first one is to dream of the perfectly integrated cyber city, the city in which everything would function seamlessly, and it's quite striking today how a kind of neo-cybernetic technocratic dream is very often behind a lot of urban developments. And at the same time, you have also the dream to produce new support to civic life and decision processes. And one of the reasons also these digital representations are important is because a lot of people think they can help rethink democracy. But when things become fully twisted is when you realize that actually digital tools usually are never mobilized using decision processes that resemble traditional democratic processes. An example that we are beginning now to have quite a number of studies on how political life online is conducted. And for example, it's very clear that people don't vote online. which is very different from traditional democracy. You acquire momentum, you influence others, you do a lot of things, but you don't vote in the traditional way. So how are we to adapt urban policies to these changes, which are also changes in representation, is something not totally clear. So I'd like to finish by the third problem I wanted to evoke, which is digital technologies and the question of sustainability, because this is also one of the things. What can digital technologies achieve? Many others, I think, will deal with this issue. I just wanted to note a few things. The first one is that digital technologies once again enable you to map things, and to map things from individual lifestyle. And if you look, what is interesting with the environmental debates is that it's something that is going constantly back and forth between the question of the individual behavior, don't trash unnecessarily, do selective recycling, etc. Very individual imperative and very global stake. So we're back to this kind of individual dimension once again. And we are also very much into a question of representation, and this has led to this kind of experiment in which, again, this MIT team has tagged the circuit of trash from a district in Seattle, and that gives this very complex map of where things go to be recycled, which of course may trigger some reflection. And digital technology clearly have something to do with that. They have also probably something more profound to do, linked to the individual dimension again, which is to promote probably a more opportunistic and eclectic uses of resources. To go back to urban transportation, traditionally, when somebody had to move in the city, he made the big choice, I'll go by car or I'll take the metro, etc. Today, you seldom played with segments with different transportation modes. Today, when you are able to know when the bus is going to arrive, where are bikes available, where can you rent a car, you can begin to imagine and combine very different modes. And you can then begin to, even in a city like Paris, to think I'll do a couple of kilometers using the bus, then I rent a bike, then I finish using a car. What does it mean? It has probably a very profound implication on the way we think about infrastructure, which is no longer thinking in terms necessarily of integrated and closed upon themselves networks, but thinking more in terms of hybrid structure, which is already what's happening with the so-called smart grids. A smart grid is actually not a traditional grid because it's actually hybrid and much more opportunistic, which has another consequence, is that in those systems, the software, actually to be able to combine that, you need to have a huge software component. And the software becomes the infrastructure, which is there again something we're not fully convinced. And this might lead, just like in the so-called Hammurabi model, to question the very large-scale network efficiency, knowing there again that utopia is often a dangerous pitfall, because most of the green buildings are not able to survive outside the grid, and a non-smart grid so far. So which should we retain of all these things? Probably that digital technology, a little bit like electricity before, do not change necessarily cities in terms of their physical layout, but they transform radically the urban experience, and above all, the mode of regulation of the relation between technology and politics. And in some ways, let's not forget that urbanization, it's not only about, putting new buildings, etc. It's also about urban experience, and it's also, above all, about politics. And I was really struck about the Ethiopian example, how politics ultimately does matter. This is with politics that we do the city. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll take a few questions. With some time, so any questions for Professor Picon?
Thank you. It was a really very interesting talk. As a geographer, you know, our trade and tool is mapping. So, you know, one always thinks it's good news when the map is on the rise. And it's certainly true that GPS has produced a kind of distributed knowledge of location, as I think you note. But I'm interested in who has the capacities to do the kind of integrating and representational work, and for me, it's everyone can know where they are with their phone now. But it's this issue of the unevenness of what can be done with that knowledge. So, for example, this is not a challenge. It's really just asking you to, you know, extend your thinking a little bit. So, you know, in our talk, you know, we talked about a place in Glasgow that doesn't want digital technology in one component of its outreach. It says, I want a low-tech box. You've got high-tech digital video. We want it, but we don't want it in that form. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. But, you know, obviously, the Global South and cities of the Global South, even though the phone is essential and it's being used all the time and everyone's got a mobile phone, the issue of sort of pulling it into an integrated cartographic imagination, whether it be in art practice or in political practice, requires a kind of another layer of both cartographic literacy, and in the old days geographers were always interested in the unevenness of cartographic literacy, as well as, if you like, technical literacy. And I'm just wondering about how, I guess that in a sense I'm interested in the uneven geography of the story that you're telling, and want to just draw you out a little bit more on that.
That the geography is uneven seems to me very clear. You take, for example, the rise of the individual. It's very clear that, you know, developed countries have empowered far more their individual than a lot of, you know, the average Delhi citizen do not has always. But it's, however, striking how, for example, the cell phone is transnational. Then about the unevenness of maps, of course. But what is probably new is a kind of rise of amateurs all over the world. That, say, does not concern everybody. But it means that between the official, the professional, etc., that we used to have, and then nobody, the average consumer, we have this new layer of very skilled, highly skilled amateurs. And this is pretty much global. There again, you take China, you have that, you take, it's pretty much, and you know, which goes also very often with this individual character, etc. So of course, it's a tendency that does not concern everyone. The digital divide is still there, etc. And as I mentioned, for me, the biggest challenge is the big power of platforms. Because now the power is to the person who is able to create a platform, like the Google Maps. I think this is probably the most powerful tool. When you have a platform of development on which everybody comes, then you have the power today. How do you challenge this power? It's not entirely evident.